let me introduce my guest. We have Monica Bulger, who's researcher at the Data and Society Research Institute, among many, many, many other things. And Monica, together with Sonia Livingston, and again, many, many things. So I'm going to give a very brief description. Officer of the Order of the British Empire, professor of social psychology, and former head of the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And together, Monica and Sonia have written a global agenda for children's rights in the digital age. Very exciting work. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to toss over to Monica and Sonia. They're going to invite you into some discussion at the very beginning, and then we're going to go to a series of questions. So Monica, if you'd like to take it away.
Oh, thank you. Hi, nice to meet everyone. Today we were thinking about what to talk about in terms of our the international research we've done, and especially around children and their digital uses. And one thing we kept coming across in our work is that often discussions of trust start with distrust, and that's the dangers lurking that might require protection. And so Sonia's work with EU Kids Online and UK Kids Online and now Global Kids Online have really been addressing a balance between risks and opportunities. And so this is going to be sort of the general overarching theme. And then we're also going to talk about how increasing use and collection of data are changing the ways that the prior work, the findings around internet use are changing and developing. But what we wanted to know from you first is a little bit of a description of the audience that you're trying to reach with your projects, and then also what, if any, international dimensions you're planning to bake into your projects. So yeah, I don't know, how do we start? We just want to go around the room, so to speak, get here.
So you can go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in, those of you who are bold and risk-taking.
Hey, this is Sven at Parsons in New York.
Hello, Sven.
Hi. I guess a quick answer to two questions. First, the second question, yes, there's quite a bit of international aspect to our project. We're working in New York, in Shanghai and Beijing, in New Delhi, and in Manila. And actually, we just got word that we're also going to be undertaking a workshop in Nairobi. So we're all over the place. Wow. In answer to your first question, I think our primary audience is probably educators, the classroom teachers that we're working with. It's hard to define our audience as the kids who are taking part, but they're obviously there. But we're working with the teachers, hopefully, to create something that will keep going after we visit.
Thank you. And it's so hard to do this around the room but I know, who else is here? It looks like Arthi, did you want to talk about Brightcatcher?
We'll give people a second to come out of deep mute.
Hi, sorry, I was on mute. This is Arthi. This is Arthi. I'm from the founder of Brightcatcher, and I'm in New York City. In our work, we don't do a lot of work internationally at all at the moment. Right now, we're really focused in a few different states in the U.S., New York, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, California, Washington, and we don't actually interact directly with students either, but the work that we do really, since we cut across thinking about social, emotional, academic, health and wellness, all sorts of different types of inputs that are going to help to support student outcomes, we do kind of touch students in a lot of different ways, but we don't actually work directly with students either. I think I got both the questions. Sorry if I missed it.
Thank you, Arthi. Do you have somebody else emerging?
Yep. Julie's here. Hey, I'm from VIF, and I guess I'll join a chorus of not directly working with students, although we work with teachers from around the world. We run a cultural exchange program, so bring international teachers here to the U.S. and then also have a platform for U.S. teachers working in ESL, dual language, and global education. So we work directly we have a pretty large implementation team here as well, so we work in partnership with schools, so we are in the classroom quite often and work with teachers a lot around media literacy, especially around um, kind of building critical cultural frames as kids sort of look at images of other cultures from around the world. They're often doing that, yes, face to face, but a lot of times they're engaging with kids through the image. So we do work a lot around issues like that.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah. Oh, oops. I was in the wrong chat. Sorry about that.
Sonia, is your mic working? Okay. Oh.
And Serge, it looks like you might be unmuted. Serge, do you want to chime in? I'm seeing a little hand.
Oh,
I'm not sure what the hand means.
says he's trying to speak.
Serge has done a webinar with us before, and I'm wondering if it's a browser issue. All right. Well, Serge, when and if you can chime in, feel free to jump in. Oh, you're on Chrome. Do you want to type what you want to say in Chatzy and we can read it out loud? And maybe while Serge types something, Paulina or Emily, do you want to chime in about your audiences that you're working with?
Hi.
Hi, Paulina.
How's it going?
Great.
Sorry, you mentioned a Chatzy. Is there a link somewhere?
The Chatzy link is in the chat box in GoToMeeting. Are you able to see that?
I'm in GoToWebinar. I can ask a question or raise my hand.
But there's no chat.
No?
Huh. Okay, it's
Those are my two options.
www.chatzy, CHATZ or ZY.com/DML all caps, trust all lowercase.
Okay. Hi, Monica and Sonia.
Hello.
Nice to see you on video chat.
Hello.
Do you want to describe who your audience is that you're working with, Paulina?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, at Berkman, we've worked with a number of audiences over the past few years. For this particular grant, we've been looking particularly at teachers and other educators, so librarians or various informal educators, as well as parents and school administrators.
And do you seek an international audience? And if so, what particular challenges do you see arising?
We're thinking about the international audience, but I don't think it's within the scope of the grant, unfortunately, because it's so short. But that is something we would like to build out in the future.
Thank you. It sounds like, oh, do we have Serge, and then is Emily still on? Or?
Emily, did you want to take a shot?
Yeah, sure. Just this is Emily. Hi, everybody. So I'm with an organization called The Lamp. We do primarily media literacy, and for our project, we're working on a online video remix editor. So our audience is primarily students ages 13 and above, as well as educators. And I have to give a special shout out to Sonia because we've been huge fans of your work. Loved your quote about coding and decoding, and we use it quite frequently in our own materials.
I will have to second and third that for sure. It's really great to be here, honestly.
And it looks like Serge has been able to type that their work is international and they're working with diversified audience in formal and informal learning settings, and their goal is building a bottom-up trust infrastructure using open badges. it sounds like we have a mix here. I think we've covered everybody. If I missed you for some reason, if for some reason your name is not showing up, feel free to add it to Chatsy, and we can move along here to some questions if everybody's ready. One thing I would love to do, and this is a big struggle that happened to us, just even launching and framing the DML Trust Challenge, very carefully picked out the word trust. Can we talk about words and definitions, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about just the term children's digital rights. If you could break down the word or concept for us and define what it means.
So shall I kick off on that one? And then I'm sure Monica is going to want to come in. Um, I think in my work, I've been working for a long time with the kind of opposition between risks and opportunities. And what we've seen really in our EU Kids Online project on a European level was the way in which thinking about the opportunities of all kinds of digital activities really go kind of hand in hand with the risks. And this was our kind of starting problematic, that we can't discuss the risks in one room and, as it were, the opportunities in another, and not see that they come together. And for a long time, we've been thinking about opportunities, especially in terms of learning, but also forms of participation, and then risks in terms of content risks like pornography or violence, but also risks from other users engaged in the space, whether that's kind of harassment or bullying, and so forth. So it was really when I began working with UNICEF, and I began working on a more international level, and I began working with Monica, that we started thinking more in terms of rights. And the rights framework kind of gives us a larger normative framework to say not only what do we see as the possibilities and the problems as young people engage in digital environments, but what should it be like? You know, what kinds of goals are we trying to work towards, and what kinds of rights do children in many ways already have in the offline world that we now see as becoming complicated or difficult online? So we've been working with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a kind of really widely endorsed international framework, though not so much in the US than it is in other countries, which is one reason that we're really kind of interested in who everyone is trying to address and what framework they work within. And the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it lists lots of rights that children have, and many of which are kind of human rights shared with everybody, and some of which are specially for children, like, for example, the right to play, or the importance of kind of learning as a process of development, or indeed the freedom from work, which is important for children, not for adults. And the convention is normally divided, or often divided, into what's called the 3 Ps, and maybe that's a kind of language for us to work with here, where there are rights to protection against various forms of intrusion, which essentially stop you being able to live the life the way you want to and the way you should, but also rights to participation in certain kinds of ways, the right to be heard, the right to be able to meet with others that you share interests with, the right to be in the kind of spaces that further your particular interests. And then last, the rights to provision. And I think perhaps what a lot of the projects here are engaged with is, in some sense, the rights to provision in terms of resources, knowledge, educational chances, and so forth. And along the way within the convention, there's a number of other rights that I think are also at stake for us today. So the right to kind of balance protection and privacy, as you might say. The right to dignity and reputation, and a kind of a confident identity. So there's lots of things being stated as rights, I think, that are, you can see them as part of the question of trust, and you can see trust in digital environments as something that is undermined if children or young people or learners don't feel confident in their reputation, their dignity, their chance to learn, their freedom to think. If those things are prevented, they often show up as, I don't trust this environment, I don't feel comfortable here, I won't participate. And all the provider might know is people are just not there and they're not participating. but I guess our analysis would be that might be because there are various threats to their rights which need to be addressed. So I don't know if that kind of, so I'm trying to kind of give a sense of the international scope, because rights are universally understood but locally implemented, and a sense of how a wide array of rights kind of sits around the particular provision that a particular digital provider might be trying to implement. So that's one reason that we wanted to ask everyone, you know, who are you trying to reach? Because rights are understood in different cultures in different ways, and that's something of a challenge.
Yes. Monica, do you want to add to that?
I think that really covered everything we were addressing, and I think an important point there is children's agency. A lot of times when children's rights are discussed, especially, so in the US we actually don't often use children's rights framework when we're discussing. We usually say child safety, and so there tends to be an overlooking of children's agency in their engagement with digital at the digital world. So I think that that's a really important point, that kids aren't just having things done to them, they're also engaging, and that's where the right to provision, having opportunities to engage and providing educational materials and positive sorts of engagement are important. And so these things tend to be emphasized more in the UK and in Europe than they do in the US, and I think that they're important points to make. Otherwise, it was so well covered.
I mean, one of the things I might add, thinking about the interest in this webinar in terms of media and digital literacy, is something that children are saying in consultations. You know, if children have agency, then they have voice, and we consult them, as we do. And one thing they often say is that the digital is becoming the medium through which they exercise their right to learn, to participate, to be heard, to gain access to knowledge. And that for all of those reasons, they need to be digitally literate. They need to have the tools that allow them to engage critically and thoughtfully and trustfully and so forth. So I think quite a lot of the projects that are kind of represented here in this webinar are, you know, you can see as facilitating rights because they facilitate children's agency in what is a pretty kind of complex and fast changing environment. And I know Monica wanted to say something perhaps about the way that environment is changing and some of the kind of coming, sort of present and coming challenges that really put some difficulties around how much children can exercise their agency in a fast changing environment.
Yeah, we're especially seeing it in education, where as more data is being collected about students, the justification for the data collection is to personalize learning. And as learning becomes more personalized, as becomes more individually tailored, that has the potential to remove children's choice and agency in selecting what they feel they should do next or where they want to go next. Instead, it might be being directed towards them. There is the opportunity there to actually allow for more choice, but there is this consideration that as more data is collected and as we get categorized into what's called affinity groups, so groups that are like us but not exactly tailored to us, kids, their potential for being able to make choices is reduced. I think that's a main concern, but also we see it. A while back, there was the discussion of the filter bubble, but we see that a lot in engagement with social media, that we're progressively being shown the type of news that the system is predicting we'll be interested in, rather than having more of an exploratory creative experience. Those are a couple things, I think.
Yeah, Sonia, I very quickly got a chance to read the blog post that you sent earlier, and we'll share this with everybody. It's and I'm reading from memory here, so I may not get all the words right, but it's 6 things that policymakers need to know about the digital rights of children. And one of the things I loved in there is that in the very first paragraph of the very first point, you pack all of it in and then mention companies. And so when you were talking about personalized learning, that's what I was thinking, is that there's this very strong monetization force that's also playing in this on this field.
Yes, as the vendors tend to lead the debate and lead the discussion on this, the educators aren't really having a say. They're not really included in the discussion, and quite a bit of the claims about learning aren't supported by evidence. A lot of the programs and technologies that are available have not been tested for their positive learning outcomes.
Mm. One of the things that Monica and I have often discussed is the relationship between what it is that we can expect the participants in a digital environment to learn and to know and to understand, and what it is that kind of needs to be designed into that environment. So trust, we could say, is something that kind of emerges from the interaction between what do the participants know and understand and believe to be happening, and what is in fact happening in the way in which the environment is designed. So if we think about teenagers using a commercial platform like Facebook, there's a kind of relatively straightforward relation, but we need to understand it between the skills of the user and the design of how Facebook manages privacy, for example. When we come to the kinds of projects that are represented here in the webinar, so everyone is working within a kind of open source public sector, educator framework, but they're still designing, you're still designing environments, and when you design your environment, you make assumptions about what level of expertise or skill or competence the different the people you're using your resources will have. So that was kind of why we wanted to start out by asking about who your audience was. It's not only a marketing question, who do you hope to reach, but what level of expertise and understanding do you kind of expect people to have, and what are you, and are you in fact going to kind of use their data well? Are you going to not do what what Facebook does, or what some of the commercial companies that are using student data? How do you kind of think about student rights from the point of view of what you're designing, as well as student literacy from the point of them as users? So that's a really kind of complicated question about the interface, but I think trust really and literacy really are at that kind of intersection between the environment you're in and what it is you know and want from that environment as a user.
Is this a good time to talk about sustainability as well, or should we save that for later?
I don't know, or shall we invite people to, I mean, I kind of quite like to know people's reactions, especially those maybe who are working in, so Sven, who is working across lots of really diverse cultures, seems to me is facing perhaps one of the biggest challenges here in terms of trying to design something that can be used in really different cultures, where assumptions about learning might be different, where assumptions about the student agency or flexibility to learn in different ways might be very different. So actually yeah. Or Serge, perhaps, if I think about Finland is often described, rightly or wrongly, as a culture that has a very high respect for children's rights, unlike some other cultures. So again, I'm kind of interested in that. Yeah.
Serge might be having some issues with unmuting himself, but Sven, we know that you have been successful. So if you'd like to chime in, feel free to unmute yourself.
Well, I guess the main the sort of 800-pound gorilla in the conversation is the work that we're doing in China, where you have both a very different educational system, but also a completely different set of parameters in terms of just simply network access. A lot of schools that we work in, including universities, just simply are not providing open access to people, and what tends to happen there is that people find ways around the rules and regulations, and that's been one of the interesting debates from our end, is to what extent do we allow that to happen, or to what extent do we try to very tightly control exactly how people are interfacing with the environment that we build. And part of this has to do with the way children operate in today's world on the media, on the social networks. An awful lot of it is not formal. It's not framed within normal educational environments, regardless of where they are, whether they're in China or in Delhi or in New York. They're finding their own way around this. And actually, in talking to Cheryl the other day, we were talking about the possible addition of a translatable chat line to the app that we're working on, and it brings up a lot of these issues. You know, on one hand, how does this move things out of the boundary, outside the boundary of control? But on another hand, what I'm saying is will children do this on their own? It's fascinating when you're traveling in China to see the extent to which people are operating off apps. Well, it's not Facebook, obviously, but WeChat and this type of app where it's not only off the norm in terms of network access, but a lot of times it's completely outside the realm of any kind of educational control. And this is within a country where educational control is, in their view, total and complete. So interesting questions. We don't, at this point, I would say we don't have answers to them. It's funny because when we're going and testing on these at these locations, we're often in our own right using these same forms of communication just simply to go back and forth between sites. And so that brings up another question is, okay, so we're controlling the app and the experience in one right, and then we're turning around, pulling out our mobile phone and getting onto WeChat because it's the easiest way to talk to someone in New York. So it'll be interesting to see to what extent this becomes an augmentation of what we try to set up.
Can I just comment on that? I mean, I think that was really insightful, and one of the things that you made me think about, Sven, is um, what is around the person who is learning. You know, if you're providing them with a platform or an environment that kind of fits with the rest of their lives, might be using technology that's already familiar to their parents, that already kind of interfaces with what's happening at their school, then they have a more kind of connected experience, and the other people in their lives can kind of come and check how they are and talk about what they're learning, and there's a kind of, you know, the synergies kind of help what it is that they do on your platform. But if you're building something that isn't familiar to either the learner at home or the rest of the school life, then you're kind of building something that has to be really quite standalone, and the way in which the learning is supported and the way in which the environment is trusted all has to happen within that site. And that's, so in a way it's a kind of more challenging if you can't kind of harness the supports from other parts of the young person's life. And that might be one of those real differences when you go into a culture where you don't have, you're not working in an environment that is already supported in lots of ways that are familiar technologies, familiar platforms, parents and teachers already engaged.
Sure, and it's what we're finding, and I mean, I think this is something we could have predicted ahead of time, that it also has to do just with uh, location and the differences between locations. So it would be great if we could predict, the parameters that you're describing, the familiarity, the fluidity between educational environments and home environments, et cetera. But what we're finding is that it may be different, very different, from one place to another. And it's one of the things that will be probably quite influential in terms of how we are able to collaborate between sites, between countries in this case, versus being limited in some instances to working on the local. And that's the kind of thing that we're finding is coming out of actually running these workshops. We often end up with more questions about these issues than we went into the workshop with. So I guess that's the nature of this kind of research.
Right, right. Mm.
Should we jump back into a new question?
Sure.
Well, one of the things, Sonia, you started off talking about this, which is a topic dear to my heart, the balance between risk and empowerment. And I wanted to start with this question. I'd love to keep digging into this. So I've got sort of two parts to this question. But in the report, in the global agenda, you write that drawing the line between offline and online is becoming close to impossible. And I was thinking right out of the barn, that acknowledging that there's no client, that line itself is actually a really profound declaration. And so I wanted to ask, does it make it harder to discuss children's rights when it isn't entirely clear where to draw the line between online and offline? Because we know that they're different, but the line is very, very hard to find. So when we're talking about rights, how do we how do we handle that? How do you handle that as
Mm,
researchers?
mm. Well, that's yeah, it's a tough one, and I'm sure Monica will want to pitch in as well. I think we meant that line in several ways. So one is technically, children and well, actually, many of us don't quite know now which apps or which devices are technically using online connectivity and which ones are not. So there's often just a technical uncertainty. Um, but I think more importantly, also kind of socially, I don't want to say people don't know the difference, but I want to say there isn't that single line anymore. Like now I'm online and now I'm offline, and the two worlds are completely opposed and different, and moving into kind of alternate reality. So rather, I think the point is that young people now, maybe all of us, live in all kinds of differently established social environments which are variously mediated, variously underpinned by different kinds of digital platforms or digital devices. So there's always a question in a way, in any circumstance we're in now, there's a question kind of who can see this, who's listening, who's kind of part of this, um, where do I go if something goes wrong? And I think all of those questions have become more complicated. So, in terms of rights, if you think, okay, the right to privacy, or the right to redress. So if you're in a social learning situation and something goes wrong, you kind of want to know, am I looking for digital tools to protect myself? Am I looking for literacy knowledge? Is there something, someone I need to complain to or appeal to in the digital or the social environment? I think all of those things have just become complicated and also often opaque. So in a learning environment, it's just often not as clear as it was in the days when you were in the classroom or you were not in the classroom, and that was that. Now
Mhm.
it's just not quite clear who is managing the parameters of who can hear me right now, as it were,
Yeah.
or who is, if someone became abusive in this situation, do I need a social solution? Do I need a technical solution? What skills do I draw upon? What rights do I have? So I think it's just, yeah, it's becoming more complicated, and that's why digital literacy is becoming a kind of a means of implementing rights, really, of ensuring both the kind of negative rights that stop something bad happening and the positive rights that enable empowering things to happen. Monica, do you want to kind of, yeah.
I, I would just add that when we wrote that sentence, actually, it was pretty. We hadn't seen that really being talked about. It was very progressive to be saying this, and it's become more and more true in quite a fast time frame. Um,
Mm,
I think just to add to what Sonia said, I think an important point is that that there's this shift from the physical world where um, there's usually obvious boundaries to sort of this
mm,
boundaryless world. And I
mm,
remember when we were talking about the project, Sonia gave the example of when you're walking through a town, and we were thinking kind of like Wild West or something like when you're walking through a town, there's all of these um, signals that you know and trust. You know that this is a store, that this is the sheriff, this is whatever you have all of these sort of signals for what's trustworthy and what's not. And when you're on the internet, trustworthy sites look a lot like untrustworthy sites can look a lot like trustworthy sites. And so understanding where to make those safe choices becomes really
mm,
challenging. And so so that was another dimension of sort of what inspired that part, I think.
mm,
And I was really struck, both you were both saying this in slightly different ways, that if you can't tell exactly where the line is, it does make it hard to figure out whether this is an environment where there's risk or this is an
mm,
environment where I'm empowered. So, and as I was reading the report, I felt, and I feel this way a lot because I'm in the digital media and learning world where I feel very strongly about empowering kids with digital literacy, but I'm a parent as well, and I find myself sometimes being very hypocritical about how I feel about this empowerment. But I feel torn between empowering child-driven innovation online at the same time as feeling what you call in the report heightened anxiety. And I do think it's heightened. I don't think it's just anxiety. I think it's heightened anxiety that you mentioned about risks of harm to kids. Yet my sense is, especially in the global north, that we're going to continue to lean toward policies that are based on anxiety. And so what I wanted to ask you both is, for those of us working in these environments, in digital media learning environments or connected learning spaces, who want to encourage empowerment, what is our role in evening out this potential imbalance at the policy level?
I think a starting point is since we were talking about language, to understand that risks are the potential for harm, not the actual harm. And a lot of the discussion centers in the risk area. So for learning, using walled gardens and that sort of thing to protect kids from accessing potentially upsetting materials um, isn't necessarily it's not equating what could really be harmful. So for example, in EU Kids, um, not every child who views pornography is upset by it. In fact, some kids look for it online, and so understanding that what might be upsetting to one child isn't upsetting to another, and then and this is Sonia's work that I'm citing, but uh, teaching resilience. So understanding, as we've been saying, understanding who to report something to when it is upsetting. That alone empowers. Understanding what types of places might have that unsafe material. So really teaching about critical use of the internet. So what are some trustworthy sites? .edu, different trusted.com sites versus, when you do a larger search, what are some signals that you can look for to avoid upsetting content? Upsetting content to kids can also just be being at the wrong place, right? Going somewhere expecting one thing and getting something else.
I mean, maybe I can add something about the process that's involved. So I think often when I hear people talking about designing an educational site or a participation site or even an entertainment site or environment for kids, and I say, oh, sounds like you're going to need some moderation in there, or sounds like, you have the potential for bullying there, the kind of there's a quick desire to kind of shut that down. Like, I just want to, tell me how to eliminate that so I can focus on empowerment. And maybe what we might want to say is, no, see that as, see the risks and opportunities going hand in kind of, not that you want to in any way foster the risks, but the process of dealing with them is a process that takes real time and real effort, and it has its own benefit. So if you want the people in your environment to trust that environment and feel empowered within it, you kind of need to take time with them and maybe with your educators to talk through how you're going to address the problems when they arise, so that all the participants kind of have contributed to the solution to dealing with the risks rather than something you've eliminated from the start. And then they will, then they'll kind of own the trust in the environment and have a sense that they too can find their own solutions, because you can't design all the risk out. If you do that, you make an environment that no one can do anything in. So you have to have a way that the participants, both the educators and the learners, are themselves kind of empowered to find the solutions and work with you when they arise, and the rest of the time, yes, focus on fun or participation or learning about science or something. But they do go hand in hand. You can't eliminate it from the start. So I know I had exactly this conversation with Paulina, not about the digital literacy toolkit, but about the Scratch environment. And how to kind of deal with some of the stuff that happens, some of the risks that arise, and the ways in which kids bully each other or harass each other within the Scratch environment. I don't know if Paulina wants to talk about that here, but to see that arises because these environments we're building are complex and they have the potential for learning. But if learning resilience is one outcome, that seems to me a good thing that is worth spending a bit of real time on.
Helena, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad you brought that up. I should mention that based on our work last year, where we essentially interviewed several experts around what they were doing with online moderation in youth communities, we're currently conducting a set of case studies on specific platforms, and starting with Scratch, Minecraft, and DIY.org, to take a closer look at how those communities work and how they're different from one another and what the role of moderation is in those spaces. A lot of the research out there that we've been finding has been around the essentially saying that having adult moderators in youth space is a good thing, but there hasn't been as much work about really thinking about the role about empowering youth to be moderators or empowering youth to be mentors in these communities. So we're hoping to sort of kickstart some of that.
And I see an interesting question from Julie. Has anyone had success with formal learning environments, face-to-face with educators embracing risk-taking? Julie, did you want to describe that a little further?
Yeah, so we work in a lot of classrooms where we're trying to have kids talk about difficult topics, whether it's from Black Lives Matter to environmental challenges, and generally the teachers within about 5 or 10 minutes get pretty scared quickly because kids ask tons of questions, and so a lot of my work with teachers, at least in face-to-face coaching, is really having them, and sometimes in school environments where it's not okay for them to take risks, to make it okay for their kids to take risks in their learning. So it's just a little bit of a challenge. I've had success spottily here and there, but institutionally it's very tough. So even though the jargon is around innovation and risk-taking and digital literacy and media literacy, when it comes down to these very serious conversations that kids really are dying to have, they want to have them in the classroom. It's exactly where they should be happening, in addition to home. But I think the classroom is the right environment. It's difficult. Teachers run from controversy, schools run from controversy, and I'm just curious about others' experience and your experience, both of you, in this.
And I think particularly in the US, this is a problem because teachers are held to such a high level of accountability for the safety of the kids, safety as defined by parents and media as, no exposure to risk, rather than what seems to be the European context. And Sonia, correct me if I'm wrong, but where it seems that exposing kids to a little bit of risk is good for building up resilience and learning how to manage risk when it happens.
Yeah, when it happens, yeah.
So that might be a point at which we revisit the question of who else is supporting that kind of learning environment. And in my current work is called Parenting for a Digital Future, and I'm thinking about where the parents fit in to a lot of these kind of learning sites that children visit. So I see, there are many really kind of interesting and innovative folk building educational sites for children and young people. But when I say, have you discussed with the parents what you're trying to do in this site, or have you thought about what home lives the children come to you from and what they take back, there's often an absence. And it's like it's such a lot of effort, which I understand, to build a learning site in its own right and to have the kids come and do stuff there, that's intense. But from the young people's point of view, they come from somewhere, when they got up that morning and they go home at the end of the day, and if there isn't some kind of channel of communication there, then there is again a channel for miscommunication and another source of problems around trust. So one answer might be for teachers, and this is much discussed, for example, in relation to the problem, the challenge of teaching sex education in schools, which is, perhaps the most contentious issue in any culture, and yet it's the one that every parent really hopes the school is going to do for them. So, it really does invite that conversation between the teachers and the parents somehow, so that it's understood, we're going to be addressing lots of different views, not all of which you and your home might agree with, or we're going to be, hearing from a range of views within the learning environment that you might want your child to think differently about. So somehow that opening that channel so that when the child has been in the learning environment, they go back, there is a context within which the parent can ask them about that experience, can understand what they've learned, can understand, how they might want to question or qualify that. Yeah. It's not parents. Otherwise, you have parents on the outside, they don't understand, they become a source of complaint and difficulty for the educator. And therefore, the educator kind of closes down and says, I don't want to take that risk because I'll have all those parents complaining at me. And then I'm in trouble.
Yeah, and I think that's even particularly important for administrators, because I think administrators are more willing to protect their teachers if there is sort of a threshold of parental support. Even if it's not every parent, I think that is really a critical piece. Yeah.
Mm, mm.
And
These are all
we
very
do
kind
this.
of time intensive.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's just
it
Go
is
on.
time sensitive.
what you were talking about just made me realize we managed to teach sex education in schools with
It's
a
true.
lot of unevenness, but we do it. But I just thought, like, are we going to have social workers
Maybe.
involved in conversations about
Yeah.
how to, things that we discuss on the internet?
Hmm.
It'll be interesting. Um,
I
uh,
had a question about dimensions of so for trust, it takes time to sort of build that trust. And I was just wondering with these different projects, what your plans were for sustainability. Like, are these things that you expect the children and the students to engage with over a period of time? And if so, how do you build that into your planning and your development?
does anyone want to respond to that and raise? We're going to call on people if we don't see you.
This is Sven. The main thing we're doing, and this is kind of informal, is we're making an attempt to create links between the specific schools that we're working with. This doesn't mean that there will be sustainability, but we would hope that it may result in ongoing interchange between them, assuming that there's some embrace for the platform. Since we're working with one school at each site, this is relatively straightforward in terms of introducing to teachers and then possibly setting up ongoing plans to continue. But as I say, that's somewhat informal. It's in no way built into the application development.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, because what I've seen in the different research studies is that it takes about a year for at least for teachers to start to understand a system and be able to use it. And oftentimes the development of these systems only allows for a year, for success or failure. And so I was just curious how that's being addressed and built in. Because once teachers do invest that year into trying to use it, if it doesn't exist anymore, then it's challenging too for educators to be constantly learning new programs.
Yeah, I would just say there that although the funding we have is for a year, uh, the, the schools that we're working with in each location are in general places that we already have relationships with. So we would hope that, I mean, actually the funding is great to get the application up and going, but we would hope that there is a greater longevity that isn't dependent on yet another round of funding coming through, because we're already undertaking stuff with these different places, and hopefully we put something in place that they'll then continue to use. We by no means take it for granted, but hopefully there's a relationship already established there that we can build on.
So we have a lot of questions that we would love to ask you, which I just want to check and make sure if you have a hard stop at 2 o'clock, Sonia and Monica, um, we can definitely wind down. And what I could do is open it if people have questions that they would like to ask. I do see I've got one question. Would it be okay with you if we just go with the questions coming from, this one's from Emily, who's with Media Breakers. She spoke earlier. So do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, and I
Okay.
actually wrote about this for the US if it's of interest, the sexting.
Okay. I'll just read the question out loud in case people are just um, on their phones and just listening. The question's from Emily, wondering if Sonia or Monica can talk about how sexting has been handled in the UK, thinking about the recent events in Colorado.
I would say that this is a fairly fast changing domain. So there is still the tendency in a number of countries I see, including in the UK, to kind of begin with a law enforcement legal framework. And that's, I think, most educators would see that as problematic. And want to find something that addresses sexting within a sex education framework rather than a law enforcement one. I think in Britain, we are getting to that point, but it's still hard to get something like. We still have a situation where matters to do with technology are taught largely in the computing curriculum now as one set of issues, and sex education is dealt with in the kind of personal and health part of the curriculum as another, and still finding a way to bring those together is proving difficult. So sexting is particularly challenged because it brings together the difficulties already of teenagers doing things that many adults consider transgressive or pushing the limits, but from the teens' point of view is often private and a matter of their sexual rights. And then it's difficult because it's invisible, as Dana Boyd and others have said. It's kind of under the radar of what people can see. So there's a kind of worry that there's masses more of it than I think there really is. And then there's the kind of huge problem of understanding questions of consent. And where I see the debate in Britain now really settling is around consent, which I think is a really constructive point. So we don't think, is that image legal or illegal is the first thing. We think, was this part of a consensual peer relationship, or was there some kind of coercion or lack of consent involved, whether it's in the creation of the original image or how that image is subsequently shared. And I think once we focus in on consent, it becomes clearly a matter where the technology is actually subservient to questions about sex and relationship education. And then the whole thing kind of flows much better in terms of, caring for the rights and the respect and the dignity and the privacy of the people involved. Whereas when you see it as a technical issue, yeah, of course there is a technical side, there is a legal side that has to be addressed, but maybe not as the first issue. So I see this as a struggle that is evolving and gradually improving, but it's a bit fragile. There's still, the tabloids still panic. There's still a sense that there's so much of this happening. Teenagers are out of control. We need to come in heavy and control them. This is where the risk framework overcomes rights. Does that answer the question? I hear that in the US it's just very diverse state by state. That's my impression.
Yes, and the laws were basically created without thinking that that youth would be creating and distributing their own images. So
yes,
yeah. There was recently a case, not around sexting, but where a high school student who was about to turn 18 and then was 18 during part of it, posted to Facebook that he had had sex with somebody who was 15, and as the case went, they couldn't confirm whether it was consensual or not, and so he ended up being charged with soliciting sex on the internet. Was how the charge ended up working. So I think we're still really trying to figure this out, and it does seem to still be kind of in the legislative hangups rather than that I've seen. And please, if anyone else has seen something different, that's what I've been seeing, though, that it's not really getting yet at talking about it through sexual education or, more of the social issue underlying the tech.
We could talk about this for a long time. I have to thank you so much too, and I appreciate everything that we talked about. Just even the language of thinking about child safety versus digital rights it's really helped frame just sort of an approach to talking about these issues, and words, they really do matter when you're talking about trying to change the way people see something. So I so appreciate the work that you've done, and one thing that we did not really get to, but I think is really important for people to know, is just how much evidence is needed to underscore some of these policies that are going to have a real impact, and they can turn into laws, just like we're aware of with sexting and things like that. So we'll be following your work, and this webinar, when we put it up as an archive on Haystack, we'll include all of the resource links that you've shared with us to make sure that people have some jumping off points and can keep following your work. And it would be great to keep this conversation going online if people have had thoughts after engaging with you and interacting with you. So thank you both, to Monica and to Sonia, for joining us, and for everybody for taking the time out of your busy Monday and joining us. And I hope this conversation continues. And everybody else will be in touch with you about our next webinar. It'll be coming up in December, and I'll have more details for you online. So thank you, everybody.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.